Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chen. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. I would like to thank the Asian Excellence Heritage Month to invite me to talk about an area that I have studied for 22 years, domestic violence. I'm going to talk about my work in domestic violence in general and touch a little bit on Asian Pacific Americans. I started work on domestic violence projects when I was a graduate, when I was in graduate school at Rutgers. I worked as a research assistant at Rutgers Alcohol Study Center. My advisor had a grant on problem drinking and domestic violence, so she introduced me into this area. We published 3 papers from the studies that I conducted in graduate school, and we found that domestic violence is associated with problem drinking, and intervention strategies that integrate the 2 issues should benefit young people. So I joined the Department of Family Medicine in 2001, right before September 11th. One of my church friends died in the first building, and my husband was the last person to talk to him 10 minutes before it happened. So I think that this event has had a great impact on my personal life and also my career. I think that this is the first time I realized that violence it is not just in my papers. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, any place, any time, and in any form, in various forms. So in the past 18 years, I have been working on various violence prevention and intervention projects. I also have heard many stories from students, colleagues, and friends. So if we go to the next slide, this summarizes my work in domestic violence. And you can see that there are kind of like 3 stages. I want to thank Dr. Shimoni to help me develop this. So the first stage is on research. So the first 10 years or so, I conducted preventive services task force did not recommend screening for domestic violence because of insufficient evidence. So we did some comparison studies, and also later on, we got the funding from NIH to look at the negative health outcomes of pregnant women who had experienced domestic violence, and those compare them with those who had not experienced domestic violence. So in summary, we found that actually in healthcare settings, patients are actually open to be asked about domestic violence. And doctors also think that the healthcare setting is an ideal place to screen for domestic violence. And we know that there are negative outcomes of domestic violence. So then the next stage on teaching, in 2012, I worked with my colleagues to develop a curriculum. We published a monograph on FP Essentials, sponsored by American Academy of Family Physicians. We developed a protocol for all the providers to help them establish protocols on domestic violence screening, identification, and intervention. And after that, or starting in 2012, I spent a lot of time working with students and residents on developing domestic violence screening protocols, and also promote domestic violence screening in healthcare settings. And then the third stage is advocacy. In 2013, I got a grant from Weyerhaeuser Family Foundation, a 3-year grant, to go to the community, to work with community agencies on violence prevention and intervention. And I also want to thank Dr. Sodergreen and Dr. Sanchez on the development of the CISO programs. It's called Community Engaged Service Learning Elective. Because of that, we had a chance to expand the program to a student club. So it's called a Domestic Violence Intervention Program. In the past 3 years, we have conducted about, I think, more than 2,000 domestic violence screenings, and provided violence prevention and intervention programs to more than 500 adults and children. And I think it's very important, and I hope that we can continue to work on this, work with students to promote for domestic violence screening. So now let's take a look at the slide. Domestic violence against Asian Pacific American women. If you just look at the slide, you probably would be, I don't know if you would be surprised that, or make the conclusion that the prevalence of domestic violence is lower in Asian Pacific American women. I do want to mention about something. Even here it says 18%. That's 1 in 5 women. That's actually not, a small issue. But I want to mention about something that from my studies, all my clinical studies, none of my studies show that the prevalence for Asian Pacific Americans is lower than other racial groups. I really don't know how to explain this difference. But I think if we think positively, maybe there's another evidence that to ask patients about domestic violence in healthcare settings, that is good because, then patients feel safe, right? So maybe that's the reason why the disclosure rate is higher in clinical settings. So here you can see that there are many different groups, subgroups in Asian Pacific Americans. So when we talk about intervention strategies, I want to mention that yes, we do have universal aspects of intervention. But I think there should also be tailored intervention to take into account cultural aspects. For example, are there barriers to accessing resources? What about language barriers? And what about legal issues for immigrants? And what about cultural beliefs on gender roles and family values? And I mentioned earlier, I hope that the take-home message for today is that violence may happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime, and in various forms. And I really appreciate that we have this event to raise awareness of domestic violence among Asian Pacific Americans. I'm hoping that this is a new beginning for us to advance our care for Asian Pacific Americans. Thank you.